relevant to do any of this for kids to connect to climate issues? Like, I would imagine there are students who are interested in climate and, you know, to catch that wave and integrate the two somehow.
Yes, yes. So that's where with a lot of the organic gardening and farming techniques, that's kind of our direct link to climate, showing what happens. What we talk a little bit about what is carbon sequestration, this really big word that gets thrown around a lot. We've actually kind of cleared that word and go deep into it, and that learning things about how if each one of us had some kind of garden where we kept soil covered, how that could make a small change to what we see happening. And then we had a good conversation right before the season ended last year, and I asked the question, have you ever wondered, you're in New England, and some days right now feels like we are down south? Where do you think that comes from? And so that gets the juices flowing and the conversation started. Some of the youth have seen, as it relates to composting, because they're getting this in school. And on the MCAS test, there are questions around growing and the changes from industrial growing to more regenerative practices. What does that do for the climate? So to go back to what someone, I think it was Yulia, mentioned, that they see it in school, and then we talk about it at the garden as it relates to climate change. And then now we have one young lady, she's studying environmental studies. I think she's at Fitchburg State, and she's been with the garden for a couple of years. A lot of that came from the work that we were doing in the garden around no-till practices.
So they're engaged and positive about it. They see this as a positive move to do something for the climate.
Oh yeah, yeah. And they're starting to make that correlation. And so that
amazing.
Before, it was like, well, what does this have to do with climate change? What does this have to do with food and all that? Now they're putting the pieces together, that really they're all connected. These practices that we're doing is really our way of taking care of the soil and taking care of the earth. And if we are good stewards of the earth, then we have a wonderful symbiotic relationship.
Cool.
So, but we're going to go deeper into it this year as well. Was there any additional questions, or I see one about what are some wintertime activities your group recommends for your local gardeners? Seed saving, dealing with seeds. We talk more about soil testing. Normally, I would be doing in-person classes around soil testing, the importance of soil testing in a very latter part of winter, early spring, right when things are thawing out. Sometimes we get free testing kits from UMass Soil Lab, because oftentimes in the cities we are dealing, and I mentioned this before, sometimes elevated lead levels or other contaminants. And by getting a soil test, you know what you're working with right off the bat. If you have to do a raised bed or container growing because maybe you have such an elevated lead level, or you're so close to the house because you don't have a lot of space to work with. Normally that would be done in the early spring, late winter as a activity. Sometimes we talk about, well, we do talk about crop planting, and crop planting as it relates to meal planning. So the youth like doing this, and we do this with the Friends of the Homeless at their small garden, because we look at, okay, what's your favorite meal? And let's dissect it a little bit and see what parts can be grown. So now we're talking a little bit about home economics, because we show how much it costs to have to run to a price right to buy this item, to say to make eggplant parmesan. Or how many eggplants will this plant produce if I take care of it? And so that's a way of backing into gardening for a lot of people, because they look at, okay, I grow all this stuff, now what do I do with it? All right, well, let's look at what a sofrito plot. Let's plan out a sofrito plot, a salsa plot, maybe a sancocho plot. Let's pull out the things that can be grown, and then everything else we have that may have to be bought. We can see the cost savings and really, well, you know, how more nutritious it is to eat something that you grow versus what you get out of the store. So that's what we would do during the winter time, is crop planting based on meal planning, the importance of soil testing, showing people how to take soil samples. What do you do to protect your raised beds from lead coming up from lower soil levels? So one of our gardens at a library, at the Mason Square Public Library, which is very close to the Tapley Court Apartments garden, when we installed that garden, our soil test showed that we had really elevated lead levels. And from the history of the area, there was a dry cleaners and I think a gas station there. So we built raised beds that came to the waist, but we added 5 layers between that ground and the soil that we would plant in. So we layered it with crushed stone, wood chips, books, old books, leaves, landscape fabric. We had to do that because the city wanted to ensure that it would be a safe barrier. And then we placed the structure on top of that and then filled it with compost. I go back maybe once a year to test the soil to see how we're doing. The last test showed we had no issues, no leaching or anything like that, which was great. Other times we keep people to, you do a raised bed, but maybe you don't grow things like your spinach or things that creep on the ground. You stick to your fruiting plants that may not take it up, may not have an uptake with it. You do heavy mulching. So we do those kinds of techniques as well and show people how to do that. Most of the time in Springfield, I've only seen very, maybe 10 times I've seen some elevated levels, and we were able to do some alternative measures so people could grow, i.e. milk crate growing, container growing, doing a raised bed with those layers, and it's been pretty successful. But thank you for that question, because that is an issue. I know in Boston, and Jennifer, you can probably bear witness, they have to bring in a lot of their soil. The 2 sites we work with when I first started with NOFA, they were all raised beds. Trustees wasn't, they were able to do theirs in ground because they brought in soil and built up, but Groundwork Somerville had to do raised beds. Any other questions or thoughts, particularly in how to make some of these topics more relevant to youth or to engage youth groups? Because you may have some youth groups in the area that you want to engage and you're trying to figure out how to do it.
I wanted to thank you for all that, and I love how you start with the foods they love. I think also church groups that are now emphasizing how this is care of God's creation and care of our bodies and everything. I think the more we could get, you know, faith youth groups to connect also to their faith and spirituality adds all these other dimensions. So I just thank you.
That's a good way to start too, is to see what faith-based groups are in the area, because in all of the religions, we are tasked to be good stewards of the earth. We are tasked with that. So thank you for that. It's a wonderful suggestion. Any additional questions or anything on the topics? We're at the 4-minute mark.
I just wanted to add to, you know, how to get the churches to think it's worth getting involved. I think to, you know, right now churches are really struggling with youth wanting to stay and finding it relevant to different churches. And I think both the intergenerational aspect of this, but also the youth having hands-on stuff, and including perhaps more wilderness trips and things like that to connect, and forest restoration and tree planting, so that you get the whole scope of enjoyment and working and restoring. So it's not just what we eat, it's what we eat plus what we give back to the nature that has been feeding us. So even expanding that into camping and things like that, plus tree planting. So just throwing that out there. And I think
those are wonderful.
The churches, because it keeps the faith as a concrete thing in terms of justice and in terms of diversity and interacting with people and building community and taking care of the wider earth and knowing God in nature as well, coming through this energy. So
yes, no, that's great, and that's very important. I don't know if you all have ever heard of the Black Church Food Security Network. Dr. Hebrew Brown out of Baltimore, Maryland, out of his church. They started the series of working with other Black churches to set up community gardens, to work with Black farmers to bring food in, to have farmers markets at the church. Youth are getting, the youth from those churches have gotten involved, and now they've included my old mosque down there as part of their network. And that is one way to introduce youth, because you got a captive audience, people are bringing their children to church, whether to bring them to mass or to bring them to a service, and that gives them something to do too. And one way to make it a little easier, because oftentimes pastors are thinking, Lord, that's just one more thing I got to do. But if you get a few older people in the congregation that are in that garden or want a garden, oftentimes then you need the youth to do some of that harder work. Then that's one way to do that in an intergenerational engagement. I love the idea about taking them to farms, taking them on a hike, doing some camping. All those are really great ways of getting youth involved in a very easy way that they kind of begin to crave it themselves. And we see a whole youth movement developing out of that, but check that out. Black Church Food Security Network, Dr. Hebrew Brown, that might give you some ideas.
I think also another, resources in the community to build are the bird watchers, and even because those pollinators and the birds and everything else, they're so connected. So Audubon members, the bird watchers can also help bring in youth in this more integrated concept.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Well, I know as we're winding down, if there's any additional questions or comments, I really do appreciate everyone joining, coming back on a Saturday afternoon. Hopefully it's not as cold there as it is here in Springfield. I am very sick of the cold. And
snowed while we were talking.
Lord, oh God. Don't say that word.
Just come through. It's just kind of funny because it's not gonna stick. It's just kind of like blowing out there.
Yeah, you're like, will it ever end? So this is my contact information. There's my email. You can feel free to reach out if there's any other questions or comments. Again, hopefully we're working out a plan now for our youth to come out in batches, like 1 or 2 at a time, so we can practice proper social distancing. But when we get to a point where we can have more out there, if you want to come and pay us a visit, we'd love to have you. Adam, thank you so much, you and Paula, for inviting me. It was quite a privilege, really, to present with such wonderful and such a lively group of people. I really enjoyed myself today.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to have you. And the Blessed Unrest that you're doing, we really, need it.
Yeah.
Everywhere, and there's no reason. And for all the terrible things that are happening with this virus, the rediscovering of local community and the reestablishment of things like community gardens is a very positive outcome. It gave us a push that I think we've needed, unfortunately.
Yes, and the work that you all are doing, it's much needed. And as I get more into policy work on the policy committee of NOFA Mass, it's a fight on all levels. And I think if we just weave it together as a blanket, the Blessed Unrest, oh yeah, we'll turn this thing up. We'll turn it up.
Yeah. Is there anything we can do to help at any time, please just get in touch.
Sure. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.